In 2016, a woman's skeleton was lifted out of the earth at a dusty excavation site in Haryana, India, and for 3 years, nobody could say for certain what her bones would reveal. Her DNA had been baking in tropical heat for 4,500 years, and heat destroys genetic material faster than almost anything else on the planet. Scientists tried more than 100 times to extract a usable genome from her remains, 100 failures, and then, on the 100-and-something attempt, they got just enough. What that fragment of DNA revealed in 2019 didn't just answer a scientific question, it detonated a political and cultural argument that had been running for over a century, an argument about who the Indian people really are, where they came from, and whether the answer to that question was ever as simple as either side wanted it to be. For more than 100 years, there have been 2 competing stories about the origin of the Indian people. The first story, born in the colonial era and later weaponized in different ways by different groups, claims that a wave of outsiders, called the Aryans, swept down from the northwest, conquered the native population, and built Indian civilization essentially from scratch, importing language, religion, and social order along with them. The second story, which emerged largely as a nationalist counter-argument, insists the opposite, that India's people are entirely homegrown, that there was no outside migration at all, that the Aryans were themselves indigenous to India, and that civilization actually radiated outward from the subcontinent to the rest of the ancient world. Both stories have been argued for generations in universities, in politics, and increasingly online. And for most of that time, there was no way to settle it definitively because the evidence available, mostly linguistics, archaeology, and comparative mythology, could be interpreted to support reach. Ancient DNA changed that, not because it validated one side over the other, but because it revealed something neither side had actually predicted. The real genetic history of South Asia is not a simple story of invasion, and it is not a simple story of pure indigenous continuity either. It's a story with at least 3 separate ancestral populations, layered on top of each other across tens of thousands of years, mixing, separating, and eventually freezing in place through one of the most rigorous systems of social separation ever built by human civilization. To understand how this happened, you have to start with the shape of the land itself, because geography did most of the scripting for this story long before any humans arrived to live it out. The Indian subcontinent functions almost like a funnel. To the north, the Himalayas form one of the most extreme natural barriers on Earth, a wall of ice and stone that seals the region off from the interior of Asia for all but a few narrow passages. To the west, south, and east, the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Bay of Bengal close off the remaining sides. That leaves one primary corridor for large-scale human movement into the subcontinent across most of prehistory, a series of mountain passes and river valleys in the northwest, running through what is today Pakistan and Afghanistan, and connecting South Asia to Central Asia and the Iranian plateau. Nearly every significant ancient migration into South Asia funneled through this same narrow gateway, over and over again, separated sometimes by tens of thousands of years. Once inside, though, the subcontinent is anything but uniform. The Gangetic Plain unrolls across the north like a broad highway. The Deccan Plateau dominates the center. The Western Ghats trace a mountainous edge down the southwestern coast. The Thar. Desert seals off part of the northwest interior. These internal divisions mattered enormously because they shaped where people settled, where they stayed isolated for millennia, and where different populations eventually collided and mixed. The outcome, according to large-scale genetic surveys published over the last 15 years, is that South Asia Tadi is one of the most genetically structured regions on the planet. India alone is home to well over 1 billion people, organized into thousands of distinct endogamous communities, many of which have married almost exclusively within their own group for somewhere in the range of 2,000 years or more. That detail, the endogamy, is going to matter enormously later in this story because it turns out to be the reason we can reconstruct any of this at all. The oldest layer in the genetic record of South Asia goes back roughly 50,000 years, to the same broad migration event that carried anatomically modern humans out of Africa and eventually to every inhabited continent on Earth. Geneticists refer to this foundational South Asian population as the ancient ancestral South Indians, usually abbreviated AASI. These were hunter-gatherer populations who entered the subcontinent as part of that early dispersal and then spread across nearly the entire landmass, from the mountainous north down to the southern tip of the peninsula. Genomic surveys have found that this AASI lineage forms a deep, foundational component of ancestry in virtually every South Asian population alive today, north or south, regardless of caste, language, or religion. Earlier or alternate waves of human dispersal into the region, if they occurred, appear to have left no clearly detectable trace in the DNA of people living now. The clearest living genetic window into this ancient population comes from an unexpected place, the Andaman Islands, a remote archipelago in the Bay of Bengal, that has remained largely isolated from mainland migrations for most of the intervening millennia. The indigenous Andamanese communities carry unusually high and comparatively unmixed proportions of AASI-related ancestry, making them one of the closest living approximations we have to what South Asia's earliest inhabitants were genetically like, long before agriculture, long before cities, and long before any of the later migrations this story is about to describe. It's worth pausing on what the Andamanese case actually tells us, because it's easy to breeze past a detail like this without appreciating how rare it is. Most human populations on Earth have been mixing, migrating, and blending for so long that finding a genuinely close proxy for a 50,000-year-old ancestral population is nearly impossible. The isolation of the Andaman Islands, separated from the mainland by open water and largely left alone by the great migrations that reshaped the rest of the subcontinent, created something close to a genetic time capsule. That doesn't mean the Andamanese are frozen relics or somehow unchanged since the Ice Age. Populations always continue evolving, and no living group is a perfect stand-in for an ancient one. But their genome offers geneticists a far closer approximation of deep AASI ancestry than anything available on the mainland, where AASI DNA has been diluted and blended with later arrivals for thousands of years. The second major ancestral layer begins to appear in the genetic and archaeological record roughly 9 to 10,000 years ago. A population of early farmers, genetically related to Neolithic populations of the Iranian plateau, but genetically distinct enough that geneticists classify them as their own separate branch, began moving into the northwestern edge of South Asia. It's worth being precise here because this point gets oversimplified constantly. This was not a population that came directly from what is now Iran. Ancient genome comparisons show this lineage had already split off from Iranian farming populations thousands of years earlier, following its own separate trajectory before reaching South Asia. Whether this ancestry arrived primarily through the physical migration of farming communities or partly through cultural diffusion of farming, techniques and ideas among populations who were already present, is still debated among archaeologists and geneticists. What is not debated is that this ancestry mixed with the AASI hunter-gatherers already living in the region, and that combination produced the population base for what would become one of the ancient world's most sophisticated urban civilizations. That civilization is the Indus Valley civilization, sometimes called the Harappan civilization, after one of its major cities. At its mature peak, roughly between 2600 and 1900 BCE, it included planned cities such as Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, and Rakhigarhi, laid out with organized street grids, sophisticated drainage and sewage systems, standardized weights and measures used consistently, across enormous distances, and trade networks reaching as far as Mesopotamia. Some of its urban centers are estimated to have housed tens of thousands of residents at a time, making them comparable in scale and organization to the great cities of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. This was, by any reasonable measure, one of the first truly complex urban civilizations in human history, and it was built by a population that was itself already a genetic blend, AASI hunter-gatherers and Iranian-related farmers, mixed together over preceding centuries. This is where that skeleton from Haryana becomes central to the story. Rakhigarhi is the largest known site of the Indus Valley civilization, larger in total area than either Harappa or Mohenjo-daro, though less famous internationally. Archaeologists had been excavating there since 2011, but it took years of failed attempts before researchers finally recovered a usable ancient genome from a woman buried at the site, radiocarbon dated to roughly 2800 to 2300 BCE, squarely within the civilization's mature urban period. When the genome was finally published in the journal Cell in September 2019 by a team led by Vasant Shinde, alongside a related and much larger companion study in the journal Science, led by geneticist Vagish Narasimhan and colleagues from David Reich's laboratory at Harvard, the result reshaped the entire field. The Rakhigarhi individual's genome showed a clear mixture of Iranian-related farmer ancestry and AASI hunter-gatherer ancestry. What it did not show, at all, was any trace of what geneticists call steppe ancestry, the genetic signature associated with pastoralist populations from the grasslands of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Zero. This mattered enormously because steppe ancestry is the same genetic signal linked to the historical spread of Indo-European languages, and its complete absence from a mature Indus Valley skeleton meant that the population which built this great Bronze Age civilization had not yet received any genetic input from the group. Most closely associated with the Indo-Aryan migrations described in later Vedic tradition. The Indus Valley civilization, in other words, was not built by Indo-Aryan steppe migrants, and its decline was already underway before the particular ancestral wave arrived. The companion science paper strengthened this conclusion further, identifying 11 additional ancient individuals from sites in what is now Turkmenistan and Iran, at locations known to have exchanged trade goods with the Indus Valley, whose genomes matched the same ancestry profile. That consistency across a dozen individuals from geographically separated sites made clear that the Rakagari genome wasn't an anomaly. It reflected a widespread ancestral profile shared across the Indus Valley cultural sphere. The steppe ancestry did eventually arrive, but not until later, roughly during the second millennium BCE, as the Indus Valley civilization was already entering decline for reasons that remain debated among archaeologists, including possible shifts in river systems and monsoon patterns. Ancient DNA recovered from Bronze Age burial sites in Central Asia, including locations in modern Kazakhstan, traces the southward and eastward movement of steppe pastoralist populations related to the broader Yamnaya cultural sphere that was simultaneously reshaping the genetic landscape of Bronze Age Europe. This was a single, sprawling demographic expansion out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe that transformed two continents at nearly the same time. When branches of these populations moved west, their language would eventually diversify into Greek, Latin, the Germanic languages, the Slavic languages, and ultimately English. When related branches moved southeast through the same narrow northwestern corridor that had funneled migrations into South Asia for tens of thousands of years before them, their language would give rise to Sanskrit and later to Hindi, Punjabi, Bengali, Urdu, and the broader family of Indo-European languages spoken across North, Urn, and Central South Asia today. This linguistic connection between Sanskrit and English is not a poetic coincidence or a loose metaphor. It is the direct linguistic residue of a single population movement that occurred roughly 4,000 years ago and left its mark on both continents. But the genetic evidence is clear on one crucial point. This was not simply a conquest that erased the people who came before it. The incoming steppe-related populations mixed with the descendants of the Indus Valley civilization who remained in the northwest, producing what geneticists label ancestral North Indian ancestry, commonly abbreviated ANI, a blend of Indus-related and steppe-related genetic input. There's an important nuance within this mixture that later studies have highlighted. Researchers examining the balance between paternal Y chromosome lineages and maternal mitochondrial lineages in modern South Asian populations found that steppe-related genetic signals appear far more strongly on the paternal side than on the maternal side. That asymmetry suggests the admixture event was substantially male-biased, meaning it likely involved steppe-descended men entering and integrating into existing South Asian communities and having children with local women, rather than complete family units or whole communities relocating together. This is a common pattern seen in other ancient migrations globally, and it tells us something about the social dynamics of how these populations actually merged, not merely that they did. Meanwhile, in roughly the same broad time frame, other Indus Valley descended communities moved south and east as their civilization contracted, and mixed instead with populations carrying much higher proportions of the older AASI hunter-gath era ancestry. This produced a second blended population called Ancestral South Indian Ancestry, or ASI, which carries comparatively little to no steppe input. These two blended populations, ANI in the north and ASI further south, then continued to mix with each other across the subcontinent for many subsequent centuries, gradually producing a genetic gradient rather than a hard boundary. And then something happened that effectively froze this gradient in place, preserving it almost like a genetic photograph for archaeologists and geneticists working thousands of years later to eventually read. Population genetic modeling, including a widely cited 2013 study led by geneticist Priya Morjani and colleagues, estimated that widespread population mixing across South Asia largely ceased somewhere between roughly 1900 and 4,200 years ago. Around this period, endogamy, the cultural and social practice of marrying only within one's own community, became rigorously enforced across large portions of South Asian society. This is the genetic foundation beneath what would become the caste system as it solidified over subsequent centuries. Once communities stopped mixing broadly with each other and instead married almost exclusively within their own group, generation after generation, the specific ANI to ASI ratio present in each community at that moment in time became essentially locked in place, passed down with only minor drift ever since. It's worth noting how researchers were even able to date this shift with any precision, because the method itself is clever. When two previously separated populations interbreed, the segments of DNA they inherit from each ancestral source start out long and unbroken, then get progressively chopped into shorter fragments with each subsequent generation, as chromosomes recombine during reproduction. By measuring the average length of these ANI and ASI-derived DNA segments in modern individuals, geneticists can essentially run the clock backward and estimate how many generations have passed since substantial mixing between the two ancestral groups was common, That's how researchers arrived at the estimate that widespread mixing had mostly stopped somewhere between roughly 2,000 and 4,000 years ago, a range that lines up closely with historical and archaeological evidence for when caste-based social stratification began hardening across large parts of the subcontinent. The scientific consequence of this is remarkable, and honestly a little haunting when you sit with it. Researchers have documented that genetic differences between distinct caste and community groups in India, even ones that have lived in close physical proximity to each other for thousands of years, can be strikingly large, often larger than the genetic differences found between entire countries and other parts of the world. This is a direct, measurable consequence of millennia of strict endogamy acting like thousands of separate parallel evolutionary experiments running simultaneously across a single subcontinent. The caste system, whatever else it represents historically and morally, and it represents a great deal of documented social inequality and injustice that continues to have consequences today, has also inadvertently functioned as an extraordinary genetic archive, preserving distinct ancestral signatures in ways that few other places on Earth can match. Geneticists studying South Asian population history often describe this as one of the most detailed living records of ancient human population structure found anywhere in the world, precisely because these ancient proportions were never allowed to fully blend away. The geographic expression of this history is often described by researchers as the Indian genetic cline, a gradual gradient running roughly from north to south, tracking the relative proportion of ANI versus ASI ancestry in any given population. Populations concentrated in northern India generally carry higher proportions of steppe-related and Iranian farmer-related ancestry. Populations in southern India, particularly speakers of Dravidian languages such as Tamil, Kannada, Telugu, and Malayalam, generally carry higher proportions of ASI ancestry, reflecting deeper AASI hunter-gatherer roots, blended more heavily with Indus Valley descended populations that moved south. Certain tribal communities scattered through central and southern India carry the highest documented proportions of AASI ancestry found anywhere on the mainland today, making them, alongside the Andamanese, among the closest living genetic connections to South Asia's earliest human inhabitants. There's also a third, less frequently discussed genetic thread running through this story, concentrated largely in northeastern India. Populations in this region carry significant ancestry linked to East and Southeast Asian populations, reflecting a separate and much less publicized set of ancient migration corridors connecting South Asia to Southeast Asia and southern China, entirely distinct from the far more famous Northwestern Gateway that dominates most discussion of Indian population history. It's a reminder that even a three-part model of AASI, Iranian-related, and steppe-related ancestry is itself a simplification of a genuinely more complicated regional picture, and that South Asia's demographic history did not unfold in only one direction. This kind of fine-grained community-level genetic distinctiveness has practical implications well beyond historical curiosity. Medical researchers have found that some genetic diseases are far more concentrated in specific South Asian communities than they would be in a randomly mixed population of the same total size, a direct consequence of small founder groups marrying within themselves for dozens of generations. Understanding this deep ancestral layering isn't just an academic exercise about the distant past. It actively shapes present-day genetic medicine, disease risk research, and public health strategy across the region, which is part of why geneticists have invested so much effort into mapping it as precisely as they have. None of these ancient genetic zones respect the political borders drawn across South Asia in the 20th century. The ancestral patterns embedded in modern populations formed over tens of thousands of years of migration and settlement, and they extend seamlessly across the modern boundaries separating India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, because those boundaries simply didn't exist for most of the time period this genetic story covers. So, what does all of this actually mean for the two competing political narratives that opened this story? Consider the older colonial era framing first, the one that imagined a single wave of conquering outsiders arriving to dominate and essentially replace a passive existing population. The ancient DNA doesn't support that picture. What it shows, instead, is admixture, not replacement. The AASI hunter-gatherers and the Indus Valley descended farmers who built one of the ancient world's most sophisticated urban civilizations were never erased. Their genetic legacy forms the deep majority, foundation of virtually every South Asian population alive today, in the north and in the south alike. Modern Indians overwhelmingly are the descendants of those original populations, not the descendants of people who simply swept in and replaced them. But the nationalist counter-narrative, insisting on a purely indigenous origin with no external contribution whatsoever, doesn't hold up under the genetic evidence either. Iranian-related farmer ancestry, present across essentially the entire subcontinent today, did arrive from outside South Asia. Related ancestry, concentrated most heavily in northern India, and correlated closely with the historical spread of Indo-European languages, also arrived from outside South Asia. These were real migrations that happened thousands of years ago, and they left a permanent genetic signature that DNA sequencing can now measure directly. Importantly, these were ancient population movements unfolding over centuries, not sudden invasions in any modern military sense, and carrying their genetic legacy does not diminish anyone's Indian identity in any cultural, historical, or moral sense whatsoever. It simply means South Asia's population history has always been connected to the wider world, the same way nearly every human population on every continent carries traces of ancient movement and mixture if you look far back enough. It's also worth being clear about where scientific consensus is genuinely solid here versus where honest debate still continues. The existence of AASI, Iranian-related and steppe-related ancestry, as distinct components in South Asian genomes is now well established across multiple independent studies using different methods and different sample sets. The absence of steppe ancestry in the mature phase Rakhigarhi genome is similarly well documented. What remains more actively debated among specialists includes the precise mechanisms behind the spread of early farming. How much of it involved actual population movement versus the spread of ideas and technology among people already present, the exact size and pace of the steppe migration into South Asia, and the finer details of exactly when and how rigidly endogamy took hold in different regions and communities. Good science communication means being honest about that distinction, established findings on one hand, and genuinely ongoing research questions on the other, rather than presenting every detail with equal certainty. Even the popular idea that North Indians and South Indians represent two fundamentally separate peoples softens considerably once you look at the underlying genetics. Both regions carry the same three foundational ancestral sources: AASI, Iranian-related, and steppe-related. What differs between regions is the proportion of each, not the presence or absence of any of them. The ingredients are shared, only the recipe changes as you move across the map. What the science actually supports, then, is a picture considerably more layered and more interesting than either of the old competing myths ever allowed for. Roughly 50,000 years ago, the first modern humans reached a South Asia that had never before been home to our species, and their descendants became the deep genetic bedrock on which everything else was built. Around 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, farmers carrying ancestry related to, but genetically distinct from, populations of the Iranian plateau moved into the northwest, and mixed with those older hunter-gatherer communities, eventually giving rise to the population that would construct the great planned cities of the Indus Valley civilization. Then, roughly 4,000 years ago, as that Bronze Age civilization was already declining, steppe pastoralist populations moved south and east through the same ancient northwestern corridor, bringing with them both new ancestry and a new language family, the same family that would eventually connect Sanskrit to Russian and Hindi to English. Indus-descended populations in the north absorbed this new ancestry, forming the ANI lineage, while their relatives, who had moved further south, mixed more heavily with older AASI-descended communities, forming the ASI lineage. These populations continued blending with each other across the subcontinent for many more centuries, until widespread endogamy, enforced through what would become the caste system, gradually locked those blended proportions in place within thousands of distinct communities, preserving them almost unchanged for roughly 2,000 years or more, right up to the genomes researchers are sequencing today. The staggering linguistic and cultural diversity of modern India, its hundreds of languages, its thousands of distinct communities, its deep regional variation, its ancient tribal populations, still carrying some of the oldest human ancestry on the subcontinent, isn't a random accident of history. It's the direct, traceable consequence of roughly 50,000 years of human movement, adaptation, mixture, isolation, and survival across one of the most geographically varied landmasses on Earth. The nation on the modern map is real. The shared culture, the shared history, the shared civilizational identity, all of that is genuinely real too. But underneath all of it, written into the DNA of well over 1 billion living people, is a layering of ancestries far older, far stranger, and far more interconnected with the rest of humanity than either of the origin myths that dominated this debate for over a century ever imagined. The honest answer to where Indian people come from was never going to be one single place, or one single moment, or one single migration. It was always going to be several, stacked carefully on top of each other across tens of thousands of years, and preserved, almost by accident, in the very social structures that were built to keep people apart. If this kind of deep history science fascinates you, there's a lot more of it waiting on this channel, because almost every nation on Earth has a genetic origin story like this one hiding beneath the surface, and most of them are just as surprising as this. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you know someone who'd find this as fascinating as you just did, send this their way.